This video was made with the purpose of providing a quick review to the first unit of AP Gov. The first thing you're going to want to know about is the Articles of Confederation. This was America's system of government before the Constitution. It fell apart due to the central government not having the power to actually enforce anything. For instance, they couldn't put a tax in place. Instead, they had the ability to recommend states to put tax in place. A notable event from this era where the Articles of Confederation was in place was the Shays' Rebellion. This was an uprising stemming from the government's inability to change economic policy, and it could not be controlled due to the lack of a centralized military. So basically, Shays' Rebellion displays how dysfunctional the government really was under the Articles of Confederation. In response to the failure of the Articles of Confederation, the framers created a new government under a new constitution. This republican government, which is basically the idea that people are represented by elected officials, was based on a set of Enlightenment values, such as natural rights, which is the idea that every human being is born with a set of rights, such as the right to life, speech, and more. Popular sovereignty, which is the idea that the power lies with the people, not the government, and that the government is a servant of the people and not the other way around. The social contract, which is the idea that citizens give up some of their liberties in exchange for protection from a government, and finally the idea of a limited government, uh, which which basically relies on the separation of power and checks and balances to prevent tyranny. For instance, the judicial branch can claim executive and legislative branch actions to be unconstitutional. The traces of these Enlightenment values can be found everywhere in the Declaration of Independence, especially in the first paragraph. Another thing you would need to know is the four different types of democracy. In participatory democracy, the goal is for everyone to participate. In a pluralist democracy, the goal is to provide people with a voice using interest groups. In elite democracy, participation in policy making or government is limited to elites only. And in representative democracy, elected representatives are chosen to, well, represent the people. All four different types of democracy can be found in the US government. Participatory democracy is depicted by the right to assembly, pluralist democracy is defined by the success of groups like the NRA, elite democracy can be found in the Electoral College, and representative democracy is best exemplified by elected representatives for the people. One of the main political conflicts from this period that you need to be aware of is the argument between federalists and anti federalists. This can be boiled down to big central government versus small central government, with anti-federalists supporting a small central government and federalists supporting the other. Two written pieces that exemplify the Federalist anti-Federalist conflict are Brutus I and Federalist X. Brutus I claimed that the new government under the proposed constitution would be too powerful, citing things like the necessary and proper clause. Under the necessary and proper clause, Congress would have the right to create any legislation deemed necessary and proper, which can be interpreted in a wide variety of ways. Brutus I also claimed that a large republic would not be able to adequately represent public opinion without becoming incredibly inefficient. Federalists hence supported a strong central government by claiming that a large republic would be able to protect the minority by making it harder for a single faction to gain a dominant position, thus protecting individual liberties. Now let's talk about the four compromises that needed to be made in order for the Constitution to be passed. The first would be the Great Compromise. So basically, smaller states felt that larger states would be more powerful than smaller ones, so smaller states fought for another method of representation, which led to the creation of the bicameral Congress. The second is the Electoral College. Politicians were afraid of mob rule, so they created a system where the president would be voted on by a group of elites known as the Electoral College instead of simply a popular vote. Although Electoral College is not bound to follow popular vote, um, they often do. However, in cases where a very charismatic leader is able to sway the majority and people and like politicians believe that this leader is actually illegitimate or simply bad for the nation, then electoral colleges have the ability to go against popular vote. Um, the last two compromises were made to make sure the South wouldn't secede. The first is the three-fifths compromise, which stated that each slave would be three-fifths a regular person in terms of political representation. And the second is the Importation Compromise, which stated that Congress would not be allowed to interfere in the slave trade for 20 years, and also that slaveholding would continue to be legal. Now, let's talk about federalism. So, you might think that federalism relates to the federal government or something, but it actually refers to the balance of power between federal government and states. So, one major way that federalism happens today is through the idea of fiscal federalism. So essentially, governments give states money, and this can be used to influence state decisions. One common example of this would be a categorical grant. So essentially, it is a grant for a specific purpose determined by the federal government. One example of this would be the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, which provided federal grants to states for supplemental foods or healthcare referrals to pregnant women or mothers. The second would be a mandate, which essentially ties funding to state compliance with another thing. One example of this would be the connection between drinking age and highway funds in Alabama. The federal government claimed that it would give Alabama highway funds if it raised its drinking age. Well, Alabama didn't. But the point is that drinking age should be state jurisdiction, but using mandates, the federal government is able to exert its influence. Finally, let's talk about the two court cases that you have to be aware of for Unit 1. The first is McCulloch versus Maryland. So essentially, this was a dispute between state and federal government on the right to charter banks. The end ruling was that federal government had certain implied powers not given to it by the Constitution, and as a result of the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, and that in case of a dispute, federal law would supersede state law. This was an overall victory for federal power. The second court case is United States versus Lopez. This was essentially a dispute regarding the right to bring guns onto school property. The Supreme Court decided that the federal government using the Commerce Clause to ban guns on school property had nothing to do with commerce and hence was an infringement into state rights. So essentially, the court believed that between the necessary and proper and commerce clauses, the federal government could essentially control everything. So they ruled this commerce clause, or well, the banning of guns on school property using the commerce clause, as unconstitutional. This was a win for state power. So yeah, thanks if you made it to the end of the video, and this is about all you have to know for Unit 1 of AP US Gov.